Good evening, and welcome back to the Pastor Study. Most of you are aware that in addition to being a pastor, I'm also a law enforcement chaplain. And as such, I have the privilege of working alongside the men and women who try to bring order to our culture and our society and helping them with some of the spiritual and emotional wounds that they deal with from time to time. What many of you may not be aware of is I'm also a disaster response chaplain. And as such, I've worked with people whose lives have been turned upside down by natural disasters, things like hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, and yes, floods as well. Um, People who look around them and see total devastation. Everything they've ever owned is now in a jumble beside them, or maybe beneath them, or maybe they can't even find it anymore. Um, And these people, whether they are civilians or law enforcement, have found themselves emotionally paralyzed, perhaps for the moment, and needing some help to move further and become functional again. In order to do that, I have some tools, I guess I would call them, in my psychological toolbox. Tools that can help them move past the moment, or in some cases, past the moments, because many issues that we deal with are not just the emotions of the moment, but perhaps multiple events in our past that have caught up with us, and the most recent event is the one that caused us to go tilt. Regardless, we find ourselves emotionally, I don't want to say incapable, although sometimes that's the case, but certainly emotionally hindered in our ability to do the things that we need to do. As a chaplain, my role is often to come alongside such people, apply the tools to help them out. And as a chaplain, sometimes I have to do the same thing to myself. For example, when I ride with the police, when I work with the police, I carry a bag with me that has in it a first aid kit. And in that first aid kit is some tools that I can use to deal with basic first aid, bandages, certainly band-aids, but bandages and gauze and tape and hopefully things I never have to use. Blood clotting agent, for example, or tourniquet. Even if I happen to run into, or an officer I'm with runs into fentanyl, we can find it on the counter, we touch it, it absorbs into the skin and we're in danger. I carry an alternative to that, Narcan, that can help offset that. Now, I'm saying all that to say this. God has given us the tools to help bring us into balance when we are out of balance, whether that's physical, emotional, psychological. Uh, he's also done the same for us spiritually. Um, Sometimes we find ourselves as believers struggling. We've gone tilt. Maybe life has overwhelmed us. We've been involved in spiritual warfare, and it's been more intense than we ever anticipated. We've run out of energy. We've run out of ammunition. Perhaps we didn't even know we were in a battle. The enemy has been sniping against us, and until some of those rounds, some of those arrows hit us, we didn't even know that we were under attack. Perhaps been a matter of such as Paul was at the end of the book of Acts, where he was arrested by the Jews. He'd been overwhelmed just simply by people. Whatever that is, God has given us the ability to do something. One of the things that I do as a chaplain is provide psychological first aid. Again, I am not a licensed therapist. I don't have the skills nor the talents that they have. But I do have the ability to step into circumstances sometimes and help bring some order to disorder, help bring people back to functionality, and back on their feet again with some of those tools that are in my toolbox, as I mentioned. Does it always work? And sometimes people need to go deeper and see a licensed therapist and work on other issues that I don't have the ability to work with. But about 70% of the time or so, it's effective. As believers, we need the same thing. Whether we call it psychological first aid, I think spiritual first aid would certainly be more acceptable to many of us. But the reality is this. Sometimes we find ourselves struggling. We find that we're not functioning like we need to, either spiritually, maybe even emotionally, psychologically. And I want you to understand that we're not alone. You're not alone if you're in that situation. One of the primary places I go in these situations is to talk to someone who's been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. And for us, that's King David. a man who knew the ups and downs of life. He rose to the mountaintop. He was king, and then he got deposed and thrown off by his very own son. I won't go through the details of his life. You know them probably as well as I do. But sometimes David had to perform spiritual first aid on himself. Let me read you some of those things that he said that helped him. He had to speak to himself. He had to kind of shake himself a little bit, as it were. Just as if something happens and I get injured when I'm working with the police, and I have my own first aid kit that I can take care of, something I can wrap up. I can even use a tourniquet if that's necessary. David had that in his pouch as well. David didn't carry a first aid kit. We know when he dealt with Goliath, he carried a pouch, a shepherd's pouch that had some stones for his slingshot. Well, he carried a spiritual pouch as well. And let me share with you some of the stones that come out of his spiritual pouch. Psalm 16, verse 7. I will bless the Lord. Bless the Lord, O my soul, he says. Psalm 14, verse 1. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. David understood that a large part of how we feel comes from how we express ourselves. What are we physically? What are we emotionally? What are we psychologically doing internally? Are we allowing ourselves to play ain't it awful? And we like to do that a lot. Or are we taking authority over the issues that we're dealing with and applying that spiritual first aid? David said in Psalm 103, verse 1, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that's within me, bless his holy name. And in verse 2, he goes on to say, bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all of his benefits. The reality is God has blessed us abundantly. And one of the most powerful tools we have against the enemy's attacks against us is the reminder of those blessings. Sometime when you're in an up mood, not when you're struggling, but when you're doing well, stand and write down, make a list of those things that God has done for you over the years, and stick it in a drawer where you can get to it easily. When the enemy, or maybe put it on your phone. And when the enemy comes to you and says, God's never done anything for you, God's not ever going to do anything for you, ain't it awful? Pull that list out and remind him of everything the Father has done for you. But I think the best psychological first aid I've ever found comes from the book of Habakkuk, chapter 3. I'm going to read it to you directly. Beginning with verse 17. In the midst of a crisis, a national crisis, the prophet Habakkuk says this: though the fig tree does not bud, there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food. Though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will be joyful in God my Savior. And then he makes one more statement in verse 19. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, and he enables me to go on the heights. Great examples. Now, I suspect if we were able to talk to them today, they would tell us it was easier to write those things than it was to do it in practice. But the fact is, I believe they did do it in practice. It took a while, perhaps, and maybe what they shared with us in writing is a result of what they learned through all of those battles. So let me suggest to you that as you go through the battles, and you will, don't just simply accept the wounds and presume that the results that go with them are what you have to deal with. God has given us tools that we can use in our spiritual first aid pouch, that we can take out of our spiritual first aid pouch and apply to our lives. We don't have to go around wounded and damaged. If these don't get you where you need to be, then just as some of those folks I have worked with as a chaplain, go find the professional help that you need. But we start with the basic first aid level and work from there. We need to learn to start with our basic spiritual first aid level, because in a large percentage of the cases, that will meet our needs. And that's the message this evening from the Pastor Study. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.